The President this morning had as one of his 5 locomotives innovation, and I am delighted that we have with us to talk about innovation across borders Sir Martin Sorrell, who founded WPP and has been the chief executive since its foundation in 1985 of WPP, the world's largest advertising and marketing services group. He's also associated with business schools in at least 3 continents and with the World Economic Forum International Business Council, and also with Formula One racing. Sir Martin.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction. Thankfully, it was brief. You forgot the most important piece, actually, that probably the reason why I'm here, actually, because I had the honor and the privilege to be appointed a Colombian at heart by the ambassador here. Unfortunately, I couldn't go to Bogota, where I'm sure it would have been an even more lavish ceremony, but I'm delighted to say that my second or third home is really Bogota and Colombia. So it's a long association. Now, many of you may not know who WPP is. I mean, you've got a brief introduction. We are, as was said, the largest advertising and marketing services company in the world, for what that's worth. We started 26 years ago with 2 people in one room, not a little distance away from here, actually in Lincoln's Inn Fields. And today we have 153,000 people in 107 countries. And as you would have guessed, on the basis of being only 26 years old, we accomplished that. We've had our ups and our downs, I have to say. It hasn't been a strong secular trend upwards. Like everything in life, it's been a little bit cyclical. But we started with a market capitalization of about £1 million. We were a small shell manufacturing company, actually. And today we're as a multinational, as I said, with 153,000 people in 107 countries, with a market capitalization of about £8 billion, or about $13 billion. Now, I just want to say a little bit about the structure of the company, because I've been asked to talk about innovation, and I'm sandwiched between a brilliant speaker who's extolled the virtues of Colombia, and I'm sure an equally brilliant speaker who's going to extol the virtues of the UK and the UK-Colombian partnership and relationship. In fact, I find myself having started talking when I was meant to have finished, actually. So I don't know whether I should cease now and just take Q&A or not, but I'll stumble onwards. And I want to cover 3 things that we think are important in the context of the worldwide economy, and in particular our company, and which I think are highly relevant for the people that are here, the leading businesses represented in Colombia, a number of leading businesses represented in the UK, and that therefore are important in the context of that partnership. And then just mention 9 things that are innovative in part, but are trends that we see going on around the world that will affect businesses of all kinds, whether they be based in Colombia or be based in the UK or elsewhere. Now, I should start off by saying that we're great admirers of Colombia. And I think I should start off by saying that we're great admirers of Latin America. In fact, I have a close relationship. My wife works with the president of the Inter-American Development Bank, Luis Moreno. And Luis and I have spent a fair amount of time looking at the reputation of Latin America, and of course, as he's a Colombian, obviously looking at the reputation of Colombia. And Colombia, I would argue, is probably Latin America's best kept secret. And we do a little bit of brand analysis. We follow one of our companies, Young and Rubicam, has a thing called the Brand Asset Valuator, which follows the brand reputation of countries around the world. And we've looked quite closely at Colombia and do believe, I think as the government, as President Santos has realized, and before him President Uribe has realized, that using modern advertising and marketing services techniques might well be useful. And there is a I think, brand Colombia campaign in the offing. But it's interesting to just ruminate on what are the characteristics of brand Colombia. It's seen as being friendly, it's seen as being independent, it's seen as being charming and kind and fun and unique, but also seen maybe a little bit overconfident, to put it politely, and perhaps a little bit unapproachable. And perhaps most interestingly, the strongest bonds, as you might expect, are more with Spain than other countries in the world. So there is a job to be done in propagating brand Colombia around the world. And let me just put that into a little bit of perspective. WPP has revenues, if I include associates, that's companies that we own 20 to 49% of, revenues of about 19 billion US. About 1.2 billion of that, 1.3 billion, is in Latin America. And just to give you a scale of magnitude, the US is about 5 billion, the UK about 2 billion, Germany about 1.3 billion US, and China, our fourth largest market, is about 1.1 billion this year. So Latin America is about the same as China in its entirety. Of that 1.2 billion in Latin America, 700 million is in Brazil. Second is Mexico. Third is Argentina. And fourth is Colombia, with about 100 million of revenue and about 1,500 people located. In Brazil, we have about 6,000 people, about 1,500 people located in Bogota. So still a long way to go. And I picked up on the previous speaker's point about Chile being the fourth largest market in Latin America. I hope it will surpass Argentina. I sometimes wonder about Argentina. I almost have this image of people sitting in Buenos Aires filling in numbers into computers, because given the inflationary proclivity of the economy and given the disruption that we've seen in the Argentinian economy, the figures sometimes I worry as to their veracity because of their consistency, actually, remarkable consistency in the growth and development. So that's the little bit of the background. Let me just say a little bit about how we see the world. The first is that we definitely see it in the context of new markets. It's interesting when you look at the statistics for the growth of the Colombian economy as to where the growth is coming from. It's no longer coming solely or exclusively from the old world. Looking at the statistics for Colombia in terms of the growth of its exports and trade, I'm very much struck by what we saw in Brazil. When President Lula took power in Brazil, American exports accounted for about 30% of its GMP. Today it's only 12%. Who's the biggest trade partner with Brazil? It's China. And one just of the same sort, but from a different part of the world, if you went to South Africa, in the last 10 or 15 years, the biggest trade partner and biggest growth that we've seen in South Africa has not come from the old world, from the West, but has come increasingly from China and from Africa. So when we look at the world, it's very much about new markets. It's very much a shift in power. If you think of the world as being dominated still by the United States with a $16 trillion economy, and if you look at Colombia at perhaps in the near future being at about 600 billion, it puts it into context. The world very much moving in terms of power and influence to the east, to China and India, to the southeast, to Africa and the Middle East, to even in Europe, to the central and eastern part of Europe, and last but not least, and most importantly in the context of this discussion, to the south, to Latin America. As I referred to before, Luis Moreno and I have been quite voluble about, we see this as being the decade of Latin America, driven, I think it's true, by two major events that are happening in Brazil in short order. In 2014, the World Cup, and 2016, the Olympics. Don't underestimate the power that these events have in reshaping people's images and preconceptions and conceptions about countries and continents. We saw it in Beijing around the Chinese Olympics. We saw it in South Africa around the World Cup. So life is very much for us about three things: about new markets, that shift in economic power that I mentioned, about new technologies. If I look at our own industry, digital advertising and marketing, although it hasn't reached these stages in Colombia, it will in short order. Some of our largest clients in Colombia are the telecommunications, both hardware and software companies. And those companies are increasingly developing digital developments in the context of personal computers, mobile telephones, video content, and last but not least, social networking, are very much developing the market, the advertising market, and that's where we're seeing the growth coming from. And the last point is very much in terms of innovation, what we're seeing in terms of the application of technology to our business and data analytics. Those are increasingly going to be the areas of activity that we think are most important. So that's the background. New markets, new media, digital, and last but not least, the importance of technology and the application of data to our business. Now, there are 9 things that I quickly want to mention that I think are important for people as they consider the development of their businesses. Certainly, when we see the interaction between our clients and ourselves, these are the things that we see. The first thing I've touched on, and that's the shift in economic power, and I won't mention that any further, other than it was an interesting story actually from the inauguration of President Santos when I was in Bogota. And that was in the course of his speech on the Saturday morning, he mentioned that he was going to build 1 million houses for lower middle income Colombians as he felt that urban development, residential development had not gone far enough. The interesting thing was that the delegate from China who was at that inauguration was, you probably guessed it, some of you, the Minister of Housing. It always struck me that the Chinese are particularly clever in terms of understanding the growth and development of economies and plans over time. So that shift in power is something we have to think about. The second thing that we notice almost continuously, our largest client is Ford Motor Company, and you would think, as the only company in the big 3 not to have received government money, the other 2 companies, GM and Chrysler, went into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. You'll remember having emerged from it subsequently and IPO'd themselves, in a case of Chrysler having done their merger with Fiat. You would have thought that in that industry, for example, there was significant undercapacity, that productive capacity had been slimmed back. The interesting thing is that now we have almost exactly the same number of unit capacity in the car and truck industry today as we had 3, 4, or 5 years ago, pre-Lehman. There is still a productive capacity for 80 million units. Consumers can only consume 60 million units. And I just make the point again that the US car market used to be a 17 or 18 million car market. Today it's 12 to 13 million. The market that's replaced it, you've guessed it, is China, with a current market capacity or demand of 18 million, a capacity in excess. That capacity in the US, which has shrunk, has been replaced by capacity in China, in India, in Korea, Hyundai being the exceptional example, and other, particularly Asian markets. And we're seeing actually the development of those brands in Latin American countries such as Brazil, Colombia itself, Chile, and others. So the interesting thing is that still in the world, the significant challenge that businesses have is to differentiate themselves, that's very much part of our business, in tangible and intangible ways in this overcapacity situation. The interesting thing is that where there is an undercapacity, where there's a challenge, is in human capital. We tend to think, particularly of Latin America being countries that with very young and vibrant populations, but the interesting thing is that if you look at the age distribution of these economies over time, particularly countries like Mexico, that is going to even out over time. And the biggest issue and challenge that we will all have, notwithstanding whether we're in the oil refining or energy business, mining business, or the advertising business, or consulting or investment banking business, will be the attraction, retention, development, incentivization, and motivation of talent. The big shortage in the world is not going to be in capital. It's not going to be in productive capacity. It's not going to be in capacity as a whole. It's going to be in the shortage of human capital. So that's the second issue, overcapacity in terms of production and the shortage of human capital. The third I've touched on already, and that's the rise of the web. Those of you who think that your businesses are protected from new technological developments, think again. These new, taking the example of new media companies, these new media companies threaten to disintermediate old legacy business models. They disintermediate them with lower cost business models. And last but not least, looping back to the talent point, they are more attractive destinations for young people in the context of growing their careers and developing their careers. The fourth point, and this is not lost on Latin American countries, is the rising growth of retail power. If we look at it in the context of the West, the three classic examples are Walmart, Tesco, and Carrefour. Carrefour is obviously much more challenged recently, but Walmart has always struck me as the 7th largest country in terms of retail sales in the world, just behind China. It's about 457 billion, I think, or 475 billion the last time that I checked their turnover number. What this is doing is putting tremendous pressure on manufacturers, particularly packaged goods manufacturers. It is often said that it's a symbiotic relationship, but it reminds me often of the relationship that we have on behalf of our clients with the media owners. We have a portfolio of media of about $70 billion, and in Colombia we would account for about 20 to 25% of the media market there. And we represent our clients, we negotiate with media, television companies, newspaper companies, magazine companies, digital companies, in negotiating the price and distribution of their media. It's very similar, I think, in terms of the relationship between manufacturers and retailers. So innovating in terms of that relationship in a constructive way as well as a leveraged way is critically important. The fifth point that's critically important in terms of innovation is the importance of internal communications. Now, I mentioned that WPP is a company that's multi-branded. We have brands such as J. Walter Thompson, Young & Rubicam, Ogilvy & Mather, Grey Advertising, Hill & Knowlton, Burson Marsteller, and many others. Managing a multi-branded company that's grown by acquisition is much more difficult than managing a uni-branded company such as a McKinsey or Goldman Sachs, and one that's grown organically. And actually, probably organic growth surpasses acquisition growth in terms of quality and strength. But if you're in a hurry and you have to do it in your own generation, obviously time is against you if you're doing it organically. But the importance of internal communications in the context of those structures is critically important. If you said to me, what is the critical issue facing chairmen and CEOs, it is communicating internally strategic purpose and structural change. And it's increasingly difficult to do that in the context of multi-geographical companies and multifunctional companies. The sixth point is what we call global and local structures. And whilst it's true that many of the multinational companies, the Western-based multinationals in particular, who are represented in countries such as Colombia, have global structures and are becoming increasingly centralized, there is an even greater need for them to be locally focused as well. So what you're starting to get, we see amongst our clients, such as Ford, such as Procter, such as Unilever and others, what we're increasingly seeing is a balance between the global and the local. It's actually regional management that's increasingly being squeezed, particularly as technology improves and information passes between people in companies up and down and sideways in a much more faster and efficient way. So what you're getting is a sort of a dumbbell, a management dumbbell, a center and a local management, particularly important in the context of developing people locally. It's no good having expatriates, we feel, on a country-by-country basis being the lead people. It's increasingly important if people inside countries, particularly inside major Western-based multinationals, it's increasingly important to have locals running a business and actually exporting management around the world along the way that you've seen, particularly in Asia, some of the multinationals doing. The seventh point is the power of finance and procurement, which I, as a ex-CFO, before I started WPP 26 years ago, I was the CFO of a company. I don't bemoan the rise of the finance function and the procurement function. But if you look at it, really, we've not had inflation in the Western world for 20 or so years, not to a significant degree, although it is rising now. In those circumstances, pricing power is not something that our clients have in mighty profusion. And what's happened is, particularly post-Lehman, but it was happening pre-Lehman from the early 90s, what we've seen and witnessed is the rise of the procurement and finance function. And the thing has got out of kilter, in our view, particularly coming from the marketing side. Our view is, looping back to that point about overcapacity, it's critically important to differentiate yourself either tangibly or intangibly, both preferably, over the long term in order to compete in an increasingly overcapacity world where you don't have that pricing power. But in those circumstances, finance and procurement actually probably have become too powerful. And the balance inside corporations is tilted very much to cost containment. It's interesting, post-Lehman, in 2009, what we witnessed was cutting costs pretty much across the board. There was no differentiation in strategy. In 2010 and 2011, and we believe even going into 2012 with the challenges we see here in Europe and the challenges we see coming in the United States, particularly after the election in 2013, the strategies will become even more bifurcated. In the Western world, there'll be much more of a focus on cost and containment and lack of investment in capacity. Why take a risk when you're not sure about growth and demand? Whereas in the faster growing markets, of which Colombia is one, but I'm talking about the faster growth markets of Asia, ex-Japan and Australia probably, Latin America, Africa and the Middle East and Central and Eastern Europe, in those markets, the other strategy will be to expand capacity and invest behind the brands. Actually, both strategies have positive ramifications for us. In a low capacity or marginal capacity world, there'll be investment in the brand. And in growth markets where you invest in capacity, there'll be investment behind the brand too. The next point is about the growth of government. Whilst many of us bemoan the growth of government, it's interesting that since Lehman, we calculate that governments have invested in one way or another through TARPs, direct investment, and other means, something like $12 trillion in a $65 trillion world. So it's about 20% of GDP has been invested since that calamitous weekend in September 2008 in the world's economy in one way or another. Like it or not, government is going to continue to be a major source of finance, investment, and influence. The nearest parallel to this, I think, is the 1930s, and we saw government investment in the world's economy, particularly the Western economies, continue right up until World War II. I'm not suggesting for one moment that a solution to the problem is another world war. But what I am saying is that government will continue to be an extremely important source of investment, influence, and client, actually. So thinking about government as a client is critically important. And the last point I just want to touch on in the world of innovation, certainly as we see it, is social responsibility. I spent this morning actually with McKinsey and a leading chairman and CEO of one of the major firms here in the UK, talking about how the attitude of companies had changed to social responsibility. Whilst it's true about 10 years ago that it was very much in the context of greenwashing, or there was a lot of greenwashing going on, I think that is no longer the case. What we see in virtually every company we deal with, in fact, I can't think of an exception, is social responsibility at the core of what they do. Now, I do think the subject is over-intellectualized. I think it's very simple. If you are in the business of building brands, products, services, corporate reputations in the long term, and the critical condition is long term, you will not do anything that offends the environment. You will work with NGOs. You will work with the government, both federal and local. You will work with all the pressure groups and stakeholders that you have to build your brands, products, and services on the long term. So, just to sum up, we see the world in terms of new markets. We see the world in terms of new technologies. We see it in terms of the application of technology and data analytics to our business. And we see the 9 things: a shift to the south, to the southeast and the east. Secondly, significant overcapacity going to continue, and the shortage really being human capital. Thirdly, the rise of the web. Fourthly, the growth of retail power. Fifthly, the importance of internal communications. The balance, sixthly, between global and local structures. The next point, the relative power of finance and procurement perhaps being checked over time as marketing becomes more and more important. And the last 2 being the growth of government and the importance of social responsibility. Thank you very much indeed.
A couple of questions? Excellent. Thank you very much. Any questions? The audience is stunned.
Either that or sleep.
Not possibly asleep. Well, in that case,
Okay.
Thank you very much indeed for being with us today. Thank you so much.